It's a distinct honor for me to welcome Steven Seegel, native Buffalonian scholar and activist. I'd like to begin, though, Steven, with just an opening phrase from your blog when you describe yourself. I'm a writer, translator, and historian by training. In my day job as professor of Slavic and Eurasian studies at the University of Texas, Austin. Currently, I'm the founder and daily operator of the February 24th Archive, a civic project covering Russia's escalated war against Ukraine. Welcome, Steven.
Well, thank you, Stan, and thanks for having me here at Canisius College. It's a great pleasure to be back.
It is. You were graduated from here in '99.
I did, and Canisius is a big part of my life and my story. So I'm class of 1999. I was part of the all-college honors program, recruited by the great Dr. Robert Butler. Once upon a time, I became a history and English major, and thanks to all of my mentors here, professors like Dave Costello, Frank Riga, Judy Domkowski, I remember them all well. They inspired me to learn East European history, and Ukraine was part of that. So I became really, I think, one of the first people to get a PhD in the field. I went to Brown University shortly after that, and I got my PhD in 2005 from Brown University, and the rest is history. So all of the things that you say are factually true about the hats that I'm wearing and the roles that I'm playing as a public person out there in the world.
Well, you mentioned Canisius, but you are a native Buffalonian.
This is true. So my grandfather was the former mayor of Lackawanna in the early 1950s. I'm Polish American, and on my father's side, my father was a teacher at Lackawanna High School. On my mother's side, my mom grew up on the west side, so in the area around West Utica and Busty Avenue, among all the Italian communities. So I remember buffalo food very well. I'm still addicted to buffalo wings. I still call them buffalo wings. And when I come back here, I'm very happy, especially during the summer when it's a lot nicer and more comfortable in Buffalo, let's say, than it is in Texas, where we're burning from the heat.
Well, how has that being raised there shaped who you are and the work you do?
Yeah, I can mention a few things. We're usually selective about autobiographies, but in my life, when I came to Canisius, I was a working class kid, really. And I was very proud to get a scholarship here. I came here in 1995. I went to St. Joe's before that for 4 years. So St. Joseph's Collegiate Institute also shaped me. And I think one of the great things I just remember from taking all of these classes at Canisius was kind of living on a straight line. This defined my geography because I also worked downtown at the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library and worked in the Special Collections Department, as it was then called, watching people come in, doing a lot of family history, local history. I remember people giving tours of the Mark Twain Room downtown, and I guess in some ways my life, especially with my family history, was really wrapped up in Buffalo communities that were often at different parts of the city or geographically in different parts of the city, scattered between the Erie County and the city and the suburbs. And so I experienced a lot of Buffalo really here as a Canisius College student, and I always connected life in the classroom with life in the city.
Well, I was intrigued in reading your bio that you have a love-hate relationship with maps. And I'm thinking, I've never heard anyone have a hate relationship with maps.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Stan. I think for our listeners, it's extremely important now, given the escalated war in Ukraine, a war that really started in February of 2014, to understand the fragility of borders and the fragility of nation states. So again, this is back as a historian covering the 20th century. In the books that I wrote, Map Men, Mapping Europe's Borderlands, Ukraine Under Western Eyes, those are my 3 books. I cover a lot of East European history, so things like the end of empire, things like the making of nations and nationalisms and national intelligentsias. These were all things that I really learned in my classes here at Canisius College under the tutelage of Professor Dave Costello, who taught these and really mentored me. And so when I got finally out of Buffalo, I left in 1999 to go and pursue my PhD research at Brown. I ended up living in Moscow and St. Petersburg. I spent time in Ukraine, really through the course of 3 revolutions, so including the Orange Revolution in 2004 and the Revolution of Dignity, Euromaidan in 2013-14. And I decided essentially that I was going to become an academic. So I had a postdoc at Harvard. I did all of the sorts of things that academics usually do when they're struggling to find jobs and permanent jobs and jobs with tenure. So I ended up working in many, many different places in the United States. I taught at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Like I said, I was in Massachusetts. I had 1 year at Worcester State College, now Worcester State University. Moved out to Colorado, to the University of Northern Colorado. Taught for a year during the pandemic at San Diego State University, and then I took my job in Texas at the University of Texas at Austin, where I'm now really active in running this public-facing archive and in working with just fabulous colleagues at the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. So, just like very briefly about that, I'm the associate chair of our Slavic and Eurasian Studies department with really exceptional people. We're teaching Ukrainian, Russian, Polish, Bosnian, Serbian, Croatian, Macedonian, Romanian. We're also adjacent to Romance languages, Turkic languages, Eurasian languages. We even teach indigenous languages, have a class in Yakut. So I am very, very proud of this, and the job that I have in Texas is complicated, but I'm constantly building channels between academics, diplomats, journalists, and I come back to Buffalo and see the amazing work that people in this community have done with Ukrainians and Ukrainian refugees and Ukrainian churches and all sorts of different things. And I'm really happy to see that still going on as a specialist in Ukraine.
Just as a sidebar, and it requires an encyclopedia, but how is the history of the Eastern Europe shaped what's happening in Ukraine today?
Yeah, that I don't know if I can answer that in 1 minute, but I'll try to give you the short answer. I think that one of the best ways to understand East European history is to use words like colonialism, imperialism, nationalism, post-colonialism, especially now, or decolonial history. So a good way that I have in getting people excited about Ukrainian history is to think, well, people who speak Ukrainian, how did that language come to be? It was extremely important for me as a professor to get people to understand Ukrainian history and geography independent of Russian history and Soviet history. So things like the famine, the Holodomor of 1932, 1933, things like Ukrainian Jewish history or Ukrainian Muslim history, the history of Crimea, this is also very much a part of the history of Ukraine. And of course, now people admire Volodymyr Zelensky as president of Ukraine, but they have easily forgotten that he was elected in an election in 2019 in a sovereign country with sovereign borders with 73% of the vote. So electing a president who was a comedian, who actually built a media empire and was renowned as a person on television, he's quite good in all of his public media and especially in his delivery of a message now, which is toward Ukrainian victory, not just peace, but actually Ukrainian victory and an end finally to the war.
Well, I want you to talk a little bit about your February 24th archive.
Yeah, and thank you for that question. So this is a huge project. Now, at least judging from the returns month by month, the February 24th archive I actually started before February 24th, when I started seeing satellite imagery of troops that were lining up along the border, and got very worried from November and December about the potential for a Russian invasion and for a Russian coup. So the February 24th archive I began, which now has over 30 million views of all the Twitter posts, or X posts as Twitter is now called, per month. It is a way to connect journalists, some of whom are frontline war journalists, war crimes investigators, people who are building cases for The Hague. As we now know, Putin is a war criminal. Academics, so people who've taken an interest in Ukrainian culture, literature, translation, poetry, policy work, humanitarian aid, military and defense aid, and then connecting those journalists, academics, and diplomats with people from my perch in Texas, with those not just in Ukraine, but really around the world. So the archive itself is not just like as an archive that you go to in some building. It's really an effort at gathering protest communities and then forming a deeper sense of global solidarity. So I'm followed in a really interesting way by, as I see the analytics, people who are in Rwanda, or people who are in Colombia, or the Japanese embassy to Ukraine in Kiev. And so I'm using all of the maps and the knowledge that I've developed through my training as a graduate student and then as a professor, which really started here in the Buffalo area, just to build this archive. And then slowly with my software team and my analytics team down in Texas, I'll be rolling this out, hopefully in the course of the next 6 to 12 months, so that people can study it as a war archive in the way that other war archives, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, have been formed.
But you don't do all of your work from the perch in Austin, Texas. You've been in and out of Ukraine and Moldova.
Yes.
Yeah,
I'll start telling my secrets, I guess. So I've been involved with NGOs really since the 1990s. Had very good friends who were involved with human rights work in Bosnia and in the former Yugoslavia from the 1990s and the wars in Yugoslavia. I also was very moved by work that was done by journalists, including Russian journalists in places like Chechnya, and then American war veterans and other war veterans. I'm fourth generation, but never served. My family was also very involved in the military, both on my Italian side and on my Polish side. So I began actually thinking about people who cover wars and what it means to be cataloging, gathering topics, and then bringing together people for dialogues and forums and conversations. And I think just day by day, because I'm often up in the middle of the night covering stories from 1 to 4 a.m. on the European or EU schedule, as I'm listening to the missiles hit churches, museums, playgrounds, zoos, you name it, just watching this and being very, very worried about my friends. So I became involved with NGOs, and then I started traveling back and forth to Ukraine. And before the pandemic, I became involved with a Borderlands initiative in Kharkiv, in the eastern city in Ukraine. And then we arranged it so that we had students come to Moldova. So I taught, because it's not very safe to bring students to Ukraine, obviously, right now. So I taught for 2 weeks during the summer in Moldova. And then after that, I traveled to Ukraine. It was very hard to get in and out because planes, the airports are not open. There's no civilian passage. So the only way really to get into Ukraine is to cross one of the borders. Entering, I crossed the Moldovan-Ukrainian border. Exiting, I crossed the Polish-Ukrainian border during the month of July.
As we reach the end of our time on this program, I want to share with people a quote you made and ask you for your comments. You said, "I can't dismiss the portentous shame of Muscovites, but theirs is not enough. New Yorkers who do not leave the island, who choose not to set foot in sacrifice zones."
Yeah, thank you for reading that. I think it's really important to understand countries on their own terms, independent and sovereign as Ukraine is, with a strong civil society and a right to defend its borders. I also think that it's important for people to get out into the world, not to be isolationist in whatever space or echo chamber or local community they may love. And so for me, in understanding that quote, what it means to me is to step out of the world of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, let's say, see Ukrainian actors and agents of their own history and their own designs in the future as part of the European Union and as part of NATO and the international community. So for me, writers like Victoria Amelina, my friend who recently died at the front, she was 38 years old, and she was covering war crimes, investigating them in the Donbass, in the region of Donetsk. Lesia Ukrainka, one of the greatest feminist writers in Ukraine, poets like Andrei Kurkov, actually novelist Andrei Kurkov, Serhiy Zhadan, Iya Kiva, some of these names. I really would hope that our audiences follow what we're doing as public activists, whether you're on Twitter or not, and read them. And read them in translations. If you don't know Ukrainian, I don't expect everybody to know Ukrainian, but I would hope that people leave New York City or maybe leave their comfort zones, read the Buffalo News, see some of the values that our communities here in Buffalo, in Western New York have represented, because those values and those communities shape me so strongly in everything that I'm doing really out there in the world and with the archive and as a professor and as an activist.
Thank you, Steven Seegel, native Buffalonian, scholar, but also an activist. Thank you.
And thanks for having me.